Thor's most powerful son has returned in Marvel Comics, and this dude is a hoss. But to get to that, we have to talk about this, because what happens at the beginning leads to that. And what this does is this opens up with the death of Thor. Kind of. A lot of you guys remember the last video that we did where Thor had basically taken the power of Zeus and then combined it with his own Thor Force power. That'll be in the playlist at the end of the video if you need to get caught up. Marvel hasn't done anything with it yet. In fact, the thing that happens immediately after that takes place is Dario Agger, the head of Roxxon Oil, kind of assembles his own villainous group to try to destroy Thor. And they did. It's like a combination of Gargoyle, who can turn people to stone, which is exactly what he did to Thor, Mr. Hyde, who has super strength, who's the one that punched Thor when he was turned to stone and shattered him, and then you have like Radioactive Man, General Chen, who's long since been like a Z-tier villain in Marvel. He has been that way since like the 60s and the 70s, right? That's when he was really at his peak. And then you also have King Cobra, right, from the Serpent Society. But in effect, Thor's been defeated, and so he wakes up in the void. Now, this is not the first time we've seen this, and it certainly won't be the last. And in fact, when he gets here, Donald Blake is here, which is actually kind of a cool thing, right? Because we'll talk about how this ties into Dan Jurgens' run on Thor back in the late 1990s, because that becomes important to the return of Thor's son. But this is kind of reminiscent of the aftermath of Thor Disassembled. When Thor died at the end of Thor Disassembled after becoming like Rune King Thor, and then at the beginning of J. Michael Straczynski's run, he met Donald Blake in the void, and Donald Blake returned. But here, it actually kind of ties into a combination of, again, Dan Jurgens' run, but also what recently happened with Donald Blake. And that's kind of the conversation between the two of them, sort of Marvel reminding us that this is still going on. Because most of you guys know that when it came to Donald Blake as a character, he was like the secret identity of Thor, so to speak, right? Donald Blake was just a guy on Earth. He had a walking stick, and that when he smacked the walking stick on the ground, that he would turn into the hammer of Thor, and he would become Thor, right? It happened that way for years and years and years. As most of you guys are aware in Marvel Comics, Thor had not been Donald Blake for decades, right? For years and years and years. Marvel had a story that kind of came back and reconciled that. And I believe it was during Donny Cates's run, but I'm not going to swear to that. The idea behind this, though, is that whenever Thor turned into Donald Blake, Thor never wondered where Donald Blake went to. He never really questioned it. In effect, Donald Blake just kind of went to a void. Ultimately, he was corrupted by the World Serpent, and then he literally just like killed everybody in this kind of void that he lived in. Thor went to go investigate, and then Donald Blake manifested on Earth. In effect, what happened was that like Donald Blake was just corrupted and had the power of a god and almost killed Thor. So Thor was literally almost killed by his alter ego, essentially. But at the end of that story, Donald Blake was basically tossed into a prison with a serpent that would basically drip poison or drip acid into his eyes for all eternity. And that's why his eyes are missing. Now, it's not an overly important segment here because one of the things that Donald Blake kind of talks about is how intertwined they are. And even Donald Blake doesn't know what will happen with Thor dying. And if Thor does die, right? Will like Donald Blake return to the land of the living since he's technically a wholly separate person, and him and Thor just switch places in the same way that like Bruce Banner and the Incredible Hulk switch places? Or will they both die, right? Like nobody really knows for sure. Is Donald Blake Thor's link to like immortality? Will he always come back to life? And so what ends up happening is Thor actually starts to reconstitute in the presence of everybody. And this is a hilarious segment because once Thor comes back to life and basically is his normal self, that like they're all just kind of like, okay, so like we didn't really plan for this. So like what do we do, right? Like I don't think he's gonna be very happy with us. And Thor is like, verily, right? Like I am very pissed off right now. So like these guys go to attack him, right? I'll be honest, man. When it comes to like Marvel in the here and now, there's so many stories that feel so incredibly overly serious. And it is awesome to have these moments where Thor just like crushes some low-level villains. Right? Because literally, like, as he's talking to this guy, or talking to all these guys, he's just like, you are fighting me in a place with no civilians, with nothing to hold me back, while in the company of a walking bomb. Did you think any of this through? Because keep in mind, right, Radioactive Man, I mean, he's literally a walking, talking radioactive bomb. If he goes off, it would be like if Chernobyl melted down, right? It would make that area uninhabitable for God only knows how long, right? Hundreds of years, potentially thousands of years, right? Who really knows? And so they're just kind of like, we should probably leave, right? And Mr. Hyde's like, no, 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 we can take this guy, right? So like Mr. Hyde comes running in, right? What does Thor say? Man, son, you better come strong. Dude, he like sends that guy flying, right? Like hits him with the hammer, sends that dude going. And Mr. Hyde stands back up. He's like, is that really all you have? And Thor's like, nay, and like recalls his hammer and sends the guy flying like it's like a front flip when the hammer hits him over the back of the head. And he's like, I also have my axe, Tormod, right? The wise one, the keen edge, Tormod that cuts oak like butter, whose blade has already tasted mortal blood. And they're like, you're bluffing. You're not going to kill us, right? And Thor's like, am I? Right? I have fought Ragnarok's little cobra. I have been the death of gods. Do you think I will not stoop to your red slaughter? And they're just kind of like, yeah, man, we got to get out of here, dude. Like, Thor's going to kill us, man. So, like, they're teleported out by Dario Agger. It's amazing. Like, it's just this hilarious segment. I absolutely loved it. Now, would Thor have actually killed him? No, not at all. But the question has to be asked here, how is it that Thor came back? And this is when we tie into the old Dan Jurgens run, because what we end up finding out is that the person who brought Thor back was actually Amora the Enchantress. Now, here's the cool thing about Enchantress. She's always kind of had a thing for Thor, but there's a particular reason why she's here. Because with her resurrecting Thor from the dead, or effectively saving his life, he's now indebted to her. And she calls that debt in like that, like immediately, right? She's just kind of like, you know what I want, Thor, because she's made it clear already, right? She wants her son back. And in fact, she wants her and Thor's son back. Now, this is why I say a lot of you guys probably don't know who this guy is, because Amora has had children. Yes, she's had multiple children. There is an alternate reality where Thor and Amora touch naughty bits and they popped out a kid. And so it's kind of cool, right? Because when Thor realizes what's going on, he's like, okay, like this is the favor she's gonna call in. Normally he would reject it. He would just kind of be like, no, like you're gonna have to persuade me. Because the reality here is like blackmail and all that kind of stuff, none of it would work. And even Amora's ability to kind of manipulate her own charms, because it's one of her powers, right? To sort of charm people, quote unquote, that wouldn't work on Thor. But Thor is an honorable man. And so building on that honor and building on that debt, that's how she gets the favor called in. So Thor takes the Bifrost and they head back to Asgard. And so what you do is you pick up with Thor alongside basically Sif and Amora, who are there with Uller. Now, for those of you guys who are exceedingly knowledgeable about the Thor mythos, this version of Uller is not the one from like the old Journey into Mystery comics from Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. He was just the god of hunting and games. This Uller was actually introduced more recently in the Thor comics when they were like on the hunt for Tyr and all that kind of stuff. But in effect, the reason why I say he's just like the guy who just kind of sees sadness all the time is because he literally does, right? Like as a brother of Thor and a full-blooded brother of Thor, number one, all the other gods fear him because with his ability to be precognitive and to see the future, he's always talking about how like this bad thing will happen and that bad thing will happen, right? He's like the ultimate Debbie Downer, no pun intended. Like quite literally, that's what he is. But at the same time, his guidance is really one of the most sought after things. Because in a lot of ways, the Asgardians don't really know what the end result of their actions would be. And so seeking out someone like Uller who can see the future, or at least glimpses of it, would give them a kind of guidance in how they should act and conduct themselves. Now, Marvel uses him very, very sparingly. Otherwise, it would literally just be him popping up in the middle of a Thor comic. Don't do that, Thor. That's going to lead to the end of the world, right? So like Marvel doesn't use him all that often. And it kind of makes good sense. But at the end of the day, because Loki is like the god of stories and Loki's off doing his thing, he's not around Asgard as often as he possibly could be. And because his role is much, much larger, Thor turns to Uller as kind of a temporary replacement for Loki until such a time as circumstances allow Loki to come back, or Marvel just undoes the whole God of Stories thing and Loki goes back to being his normal trickster self. I don't know that he will, to be honest with you guys. I think Loki will probably stay this way in Marvel Comics for the foreseeable future. But at the end of the day, there is a kind of back and forth here, because one of the things that goes on is that Sif is like, you really shouldn't do this, man. Like she literally says that. No good will come of this, Thor. The mere fact that it takes such magic to achieve the return of Amora's child should tell you that. For the last time, will you not reconsider? But ultimately, Thor is bound by honor. He says, I have done so, Sif, many times, but I was not with young Eric in his hour of need, and his mother was with me in mine. Thus, honor leads my mind to the place my heart already was. Eric deserves Valhalla, but he also deserves to see his mother again in the living lands. What comes after that? We will decide. Now, two things. Number one, Eric is not the son who's going to come back. And number two, yes, Eric did die. Now, Eric is one of the children of Amora the Enchantress. Eric actually died at the end of Strange Academy, which we never finished, did we? We need to finish Strange Academy. When like Dormammu launches an assault on Doctor Strange's school. Dude, Strange Academy was amazing. Like the finals, like the final story arc, it was really, 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 really good. We need to pick back up with that. But in effect, like that kid died, right? So kind of spoiler alert for the ending of that. But the bigger point is that Thor is operating under false pretenses, and Amora kind of allows him to, right? You know, she's like, this fire will be the focus of my spell. Your all power will be the fuel. Have no fear, you will not be granting me any measure of that cosmic might, right? I'm not going to steal your power from you. I'm not Agatha Harkness. Instead, you will simply channel it through me into Uller's flame. And through this, my son will be restored. And literally Thor's just like, say his name, right, Eric? Like, I would have you speak his name if you're going to bring him back. And he says, for it occurs to me that you have more than one son in need of restoring. Ove, your child and Namor's from a possible future, lost his magic and much of his strength in a battle with Captain Marvel. You swore vengeance on her, and I know how your mind works. Now, of course, yes, Amora the Enchantress has a son with Namor the Submariner, because Amora the Enchantress kinda gets around, man. No other way to put it, right? Just no other way to put it. But at the end of the day, and this is one of those cool plot threads that Marvel's kind of setting in motion that may or may not come to fruition at some point in time, Amora is just kind of like, I mean, yeah, right? I still owe, you know, Carol Danvers probably a dagger to the heart. So at some point we'll get into a fight, and I'd be kind of curious to see who would win in that fight between like Amora the Enchantress and Carol Danvers, because two different kinds of power meeting head on with two women who just want to savagely destroy each other, I think it'd be kind of cool. But at the end of the day, she's like, this has nothing to do with any of those children that you've talked about. Instead, she's like, I give you my word, right? But not just my word, my oath. And I swear that oath upon my own blood. Now let my blood seek its own. Now here's the cool thing about this, right? Is because with Amora the Enchantress spilling her own blood and swearing an oath, it's a blood oath. She's bound to this. So if she were to lie to Thor, there would be dire consequences in the realm of magic. She could lose her powers, she could die, who knows how that would unfold. So in effect, it's her way of saying, I am telling the truth. And so ultimately, the spell is cast, right? And that's when Thor's son pops back up, because initially Thor doesn't really see what's going on, and he's like, okay, like, is it done, right? Because that was a pretty bright flash of light. And man, you know, like, I'm tired of looking at it. But Sif sees everything, because remember, Sif is the replacement for Heimdall after Heimdall's death. With the all-seeing eyes, she's like, Thor, this isn't right. You should not have agreed to this, right? What you're unleashing here on Earth, it would lead to the ruin of all. And Thor, again, not really seeing anything, is just like, I mean, it's Eric, right? Like, I mean, how he's harmless. How dangerous could it be? And she's like, that's not Eric, Thor, and it's not Ove, right? It's someone that I've never seen before, right? But the danger he represents is incredible, because what ends up happening is this voice comes out of nowhere, and Thor is just like, Amora, what have you done? Like, what have you unleashed here, right? And what this does is it leads to this guy just saying, I remember a battle for Asgard's very heart and soul. You were there, mother, and you, Lady Sif, I fell in the fight, and you bore me away. And then time itself ended. And so Amora chimes in, and she says, if it's any consolation, you were right. Eric deserves peace, and Ove made his own bed. Still, I did study certain future timelines for Ove's sake, and I learned in such studies that I had had another son in a future that was and is no more. And Thor says, because my future self undid it all, And with good reason. That future Thor gifted me his memories to ensure no part of his dark tale could ever happen again. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. You guys are like, oh my God, is this like, what is it, Thor in the future from like the whole Jason Aaron God of Thunder run? No, it is not that version of All-Father Thor. It's a lot cooler. Well, I don't know a lot cooler, but it's very, very, very cool. And so Amor is just kind of like no part Thor. Was it all so dark and terrible? And so like he was kind of a bright light in all of this. And that's even what Thor says, right? Some barriers should not be broken, Amora, but no, to lose him, that was dark. He was the light of that dark age. And that's when you find out the son that's returned is Magni. Now, here's the story of Magni, because it's wildly fascinating. So back during Dandrugen's run, right, that was the run where Odin, like, quote unquote, died against Surtur, which is why Odin was not present during, like, Thor Disassembled or Thor Ragnarok, whatever story you want to call it. But what ended up happening is that in, like, issue number 68, I think, from Thor Volume 2, it's like, Asgard 2020 or Thor 2020 or something along those lines. The long and short of it is that Thor and the Asgardians seize control of Earth. They take over the entirety of Earth. Jane Foster leads rebel forces against like Thor and the Asgardians, but Magni ends up learning how hardcore Thor and his forces is. But Magni is raised under the idea that Asgard is like the right way and they do everything perfect and yada, yada, yada. But ultimately he ends up realizing how terrible the Asgardians are, cataloging humans, wiping out resistance. It's crazy, right? Thor literally becoming a dictator. The story is incredible. I loved it back in the day. I won't spoil too much of it in case you guys are interested in me covering it. If you are, let me know. But Magni is the son of Thor, and this kid is powerful. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Let me know if you want me to cover this story, and I will catch you all later. Peace.